My name is Daniel, and I'm 24 now, but this happened to me 8 years ago when I was 16 and in high school. To this day, it's still one of the most terrifying things I've ever experienced, and I don't think I'll ever be able to forget it. For context, I went to a medium-sized public high school in Ohio. It wasn't the kind of school people really bragged about attending. It was old, with those flickering yellow-tinted lights, tile floors that always squeaked under your sneakers, and drafty windows that hadn't been replaced in decades. Everyone in town liked to say the school was haunted, partly because of its age, and partly because of the stories that had floated around for years. Rumors about students who had died from accidents in the building, falls down stairwells, car crashes in the parking lot, one who supposedly drowned in the pool during swim practice. It was the usual small-town ghost story kind of thing. Nobody really believed it, but people liked to make jokes just to freak out the freshmen. Except, what happened to me wasn't a joke. And I wish I could tell myself it was just a mix of stress and imagination, but even years later I still have nightmares about it. It started in the fall of my junior year. I had been staying late after school for drama rehearsals because I was part of the stage crew. Rehearsals always ran late in our auditorium, which was at the far end of the building. That meant most of the halls were already empty and eerily quiet by the time we wrapped up. On this particular night, rehearsal ran even later than usual, almost until 9 o'clock. By then, the janitorial staff had already finished their rounds and locked most of the classrooms, and the only working exit on my end of the building was through the back hallway near the abandoned wing of the school. Now, I need to explain what I mean by abandoned wing. Our school was built in the 50s, but one of the wings, 2 floors of classrooms, had been sealed off about 10 years before I even attended. Supposedly it had water damage and electrical problems and would have been too expensive to renovate, so they just locked it up. Still, the doors leading into it were there, covered in chains and padlocks, some of the windows boarded from the outside. Everyone knew about it, but students weren't supposed to go near it. Naturally, rumors built up around it. People claimed they saw shadows move behind the glass, or that if you pressed your ear against the locked metal doors, sometimes you could hear someone walking on the other side. Anyway, that night, I had to pass by it to leave. The hallway was dead quiet except for the buzzing of the lights above. I remember I was scrolling through my phone as I walked, the rubber tips of my sneakers squeaking on the floor. When I passed the chained double doors leading into the sealed wing, I heard it. A knock. At first, I thought I imagined it, because it was so faint. Just a dull thud that echoed through the empty hall. But I froze, staring at those big metal doors. And then it happened again. Clearer this time. Someone or something was knocking from the inside. I wanted to believe it was a janitor, or maybe an echo. But I knew better. That wing wasn't used, nobody was inside. At least, there wasn't supposed to be. I muttered "nope" under my breath and picked up my pace, heading toward the back doors near the parking lot. But right when I walked past the last classroom before the exit, I heard something else. The sound of a chair scraping across tile, loud like it was inches away from me. I swear it came from inside that locked-off wing. Curiosity got the better of me. I turned and glanced back. That's when I saw it. Through one of the skinny rectangular windows set into the chain doors, I swore I saw movement, just a silhouette, a figure standing completely still in the shadows, tall, not a teacher, not a student, just standing there. They didn't move. And I told myself I was crazy, that the shadows were playing a trick on me. But then, slowly, the figure raised its hand. First it pressed its palm flat against the glass. Then, it dragged its fingers down across it, squealing against the surface with the faintest screech sound. My whole body went cold. I ran. By the time I got to the back doors, I was fumbling with the push bar, trying to shove it open. For a split second, I thought it was jammed or worse, locked, but finally it gave way, and I practically fell out into the night air. I bolted to my car, sped home, and convinced myself that it had to be stress or exhaustion messing with me. The next day, though, something even stranger happened. When I walked into school that morning, I overheard 2 sophomores whispering in the hallway. One of them said, quietly, that they found something weird near the abandoned wing. A janitor had discovered that the metal lock on the chain doors had been snapped off, just hanging loose. Everyone figured it was some dumb prank with bolt cutters. But when I passed by the hallway on my way to class, I stopped. The lock wasn't just broken, the chains were neatly laid in a pile on the floor, almost carefully arranged. After that, things got worse. Every day I stayed late for rehearsal, the noises came back. Footsteps behind the locked doors, knocking, faint scratching on the glass, like fingernails dragging down inch by inch. The figure, too, I saw it twice more, both times standing perfectly still on the other side, as if waiting for me. But the worst night was the last night I ever stayed late for rehearsal. That night, the director excused us right before 10 o'clock. Everyone else left through the main entrance, but like an idiot, I went the way I usually did down the back corridor. The second I turned that corner, I froze. The chain doors were wide open. I don't think anyone else noticed, but I did, and I'll never forget what I saw inside. Beyond the doors stretched a completely dark hallway. The tiles on the floor were chipped, the old lockers were rusted and dented, and I swear I could smell mold and something else like iron, sharp and metallic. As I stood there frozen, I heard movement, slow, deliberate footsteps echoing toward me in the dark. It wasn't my imagination this time. It wasn't the building creaking. Someone was in there, walking closer. I should have run immediately, but I was rooted in place. Then came the sound of breathing, heavy, ragged, like whoever it was standing just beyond the shadows of the doorway. That's when I finally bolted. But as I turned, I heard it, clear as day, a whisper, echoing from the dark hallway inside. "You shouldn't be here." I never ran so fast in my life. The next morning, when I worked up the courage to go back to school, the doors to that wing were sealed again. New chains, a new lock, almost like nothing had happened. No one else I knew ever saw them open, and when I asked a teacher about it, they just gave me a weird look and said, "That part of the school has been locked up for years, it's not safe, don't go near it." I never stayed late for rehearsals again. In fact, I quit drama completely. Even now, nearly a decade later, I don't like walking alone in dark hallways, especially in schools or old buildings. Every once in a while, I still remember that voice. "You shouldn't be here." And sometimes I wonder if it wasn't just a warning. Maybe it was a promise. My name is Daniel. I'm 19 years old, and this story happened just 2 years ago when I was a junior in high school. I've told it to a few close friends, but it's one of those experiences I usually keep to myself because it still doesn't make sense to me. For context, my high school was old, like built in the 1960s old. It was a huge, square-shaped building with long hallways that all looked identical. Most of the classrooms had these heavy wooden doors with tiny square windows, and the ceilings had those white acoustic tiles that looked stained from years of water damage. The kind of place that already felt unsettling if you were ever there alone. Now, at my school, there was this rule that if you failed a certain number of classes, you had to attend credit recovery, which basically meant you stayed after school to redo assignments on a monitored computer system. I wasn't failing, but one of my friends was, and I usually stayed with him just to keep him company. The teacher overseeing credit recovery was this older guy who honestly didn't care if you finished work or not. He'd usually sit at his desk, grade papers, and leave us to it. This one night, though, things were different. My friend had gotten picked up early, but I still had to wait because I didn't have a ride home until 6. The teacher supervising us said he'd be right back around 5:15 and just never came back. I was sitting alone in the computer lab, trying to waste time. The silence was heavy. Not the normal kind of school silence, you could literally hear the faint buzzing of the fluorescent lights. Around 5:30, I started hearing footsteps in the hall. At first, I assumed it was the teacher coming back, but the footsteps didn't sound like they were heading toward the lab. They were slow, echoing, pacing back and forth outside. I figured maybe it was the janitor, but when I peeked through the lab door's little window, the hallway was empty. That's when I heard a knock. It wasn't on the lab door, it came from down the hall. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, echoing off the lockers. I froze, waiting for whoever it was to show themselves, but nothing. I sat back down, trying to shake it off, but a few minutes later it happened again. 3 knocks, this time closer. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was probably some kid messing around, but then I remembered. The building was locked at 5 o'clock. There shouldn't have been anyone in the school but me. I decided I wasn't waiting for my ride inside anymore. I packed up my bag and opened the lab door. The hallway stretched out in both directions, empty. I turned right toward the stairwell. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. About halfway down the hall, one of the classroom doors was wide open. I knew for a fact it had been closed earlier because the custodians were strict about locking every room after school. I stopped walking, just staring at it. And then, slowly, a hand slid out from behind the door frame. Pale, thin fingers curled around the edge of the door, almost like whoever it was wanted me to see them. I bolted. I sprinted down the hall, shoving through the stairwell doors and running down 2 flights. But as I got to the bottom, I froze again. At the end of the hallway, past the glass doors that led outside, I could see a figure standing under the flickering exit sign. They weren't moving, just standing there, like they were waiting. I turned back toward the stairs, but as I did, I heard footsteps above me fast, heavy footsteps coming down. Whoever had been up there was now in the stairwell. In pure panic, I ducked into the first classroom I saw. It was dark, desks lined up in neat rows, and it smelled faintly like old chalk. I pressed myself into the corner, trying to quiet my breathing. That's when I heard it. The sound of the door I had just come through clicking shut. And then, a whisper, clear as day, coming from somewhere inside the room with me. "Why are you here?" I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just clutched my backpack straps so tightly my hands went numb. After what felt like forever, I heard the door open again, then close softly. I waited and waited, and when I finally built up the courage, I ran. I didn't even look around. I just sprinted down the hall, out the front entrance, and didn't stop until I was standing in the parking lot, gasping for air. When my mom pulled up a few minutes later, I begged her not to make me stay after school anymore. She thought I was just being dramatic, but I never set foot in that building after 5 again. The twist came a few weeks later. I overheard a teacher talking about how, back in the 80s, a janitor had died of a heart attack in the stairwell of the school. The exact same stairwell I heard those footsteps in. Some kids even claimed they'd seen someone pacing the hall after hours, but security footage never caught anyone. I don't know if what I saw that night was a person, a prank, or something else. But I do know one thing. Someone or something knew I was there, and they wanted me to know they weren't alone. My name is Rachel. I am 22 now, but this happened when I was 15, during my freshman year of high school. The school I attended was one of those older brick buildings built in the 1970s. Most of it had been renovated over the years, but the basement level hadn't been touched since it was built. Down there were a few extra classrooms, an outdated computer lab that nobody used anymore, and a small library that had been left behind when the school added a newer one upstairs. The basement always felt different from the rest of the building. The walls were painted this pale yellow that looked almost gray in the dim lighting. The air had a damp, heavy smell, like mold that had been painted over instead of removed. And the fluorescent lights overhead made this constant buzzing sound, some of them flickering every few seconds, leaving parts of the hallway in shadow. Most students avoided the basement unless they had to, but my English class met there every day. Our teacher liked to give us independent reading periods, so sometimes we spread out into the old basement library. The teachers insisted it was perfectly fine, but no one ever liked being down there. One Friday, our teacher told us to bring in books for silent reading. I forgot mine. When I told her, she waved me off and told me to grab something from the basement library. I went in alone. The library wasn't very big, maybe 5 or 6 rows of shelves. Most of the books were outdated encyclopedias, reference books no one touched anymore, and a random mix of novels. The carpet was so thin and worn that every step echoed off the cement floor beneath it. I started scanning the shelves, but something caught my attention right away. One of the books was sticking out farther than the rest. It didn't have a title on the spine, just a plain red cover, darkened with age. It felt heavier than it looked. I opened it, expecting to see faded print, but the pages weren't printed at all. They were handwritten, page after page, filled with names written in neat black ink. At first I thought it was some sort of sign-in sheet or maybe an old school project, but the more I flipped through it, the more unsettling it became. The names weren't organized, they weren't alphabetical or separated by grade. They were just listed. Some I didn't recognize, but others I did. A few belonged to older students who had graduated, but I started noticing names I definitely knew. Current students, people in my grade. And then, I reached the most recent page. The last 3 names written there were all kids in my English class. Underneath them, there was a blank line waiting to be filled. A chill ran through me. I slammed the book shut, shoved it back onto the shelf, and walked out without another look. Back in class, I couldn't concentrate. I kept staring at the 3 kids I thought I had seen written down, wondering why their names were there. That night, I could barely sleep. My brain kept replaying the image of the book, that blank line sitting at the bottom of the page like it was waiting. By Monday, I couldn't take it anymore. During lunch, I went back to the basement library by myself. I needed to see it again, just to prove to myself it was real. But when I got to the shelf, the red book was gone. The spot where I had pulled it from was completely empty. I left quickly, telling myself maybe a teacher moved it. But over the next week, strange things started happening. The first student whose name I remembered from the book stopped coming to school. Teachers gave us vague answers, saying he had been hospitalized for personal reasons. A few days later, another student whose name I had seen suddenly transferred schools. No one explained why. That left one more name I clearly remembered, a girl who sat directly behind me in English class. And then one morning, her desk was empty. I leaned over and quietly asked my teacher where she was. He looked uncomfortable before saying, "She won't be returning." He didn't explain anything else. By this point, I was terrified. I didn't tell anyone about the book. I didn't want them to think I was making it up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. A few days later, I walked past the basement library on my way to class. For a second, I thought I saw something through the narrow window on the door. The shelves looked normal, but one of them had a single book sitting on it, a red one. When I opened the door, the shelf was empty, but on one of the tables in the center of the room, there was a sheet of paper folded neatly in half. I picked it up with shaking hands. It was a roster page, dated almost 20 years earlier. Every name on it had been crossed out in black ink, except for one. My name. I dropped it and ran out of there. To this day, I don't know who wrote those names, or why they kept appearing. The red book never showed up again. But sometimes I think about that blank line at the bottom of the page the first time I saw it, like it was waiting to be filled.